This science fiction story begins with an astronaut named John, who has just woken up from a long sleep inside a hibernation chamber after several months. After being in the chamber for so long, John feels very strange. So he steps out and heads towards his other teammates. The actual situation is that John and his friends are astronauts who have been sent on a mission. They soon establish contact with the command center on Earth, where several scientists are leading them. From their conversation, we learn that John and his entire team are heading to one of Saturn's moons. Their objective is to extract several natural resources from there, which could be highly useful for the people on Earth. Years of research had already been conducted, and once they confirmed that this moon contains the highest concentration of valuable resources, John and 2 other astronauts were sent on the mission. After emerging from the hibernation chamber, John meets one of his fellow astronauts, Nick. They also have a captain named Frank. The 3 of them are operating the entire spaceship, moving steadily toward the planet. The mission is expected to take several years to complete, so everything, including daily routines, has been planned carefully to minimize workload. John, Nick, and the captain are diligently handling their maintenance tasks and regularly sending reports back to Earth. After completing their daily routines, they would go back into hibernation for several days. This method also helps conserve resources and makes the long journey feel shorter. However, there's just one catch: before going into hibernation, they have to take a special drug. Only after taking it can they sleep properly. But none of them had imagined that taking this drug could eventually become so dangerous. Now, as John talks to Nick after waking up from hibernation, he begins to feel something odd. He confesses that he's losing memories of his girlfriend, Zoe. He can't even remember what her real voice sounded like. At this point, Nick tries to comfort him, saying it's probably a side effect of the hibernation drugs. Some memories tend to fade temporarily, but they usually come back later. After this conversation, John stops worrying and focuses on completing the mission. As time passes, everyone returns to their routines, keeps the spaceship in working order, and sends system status reports back to Earth. But John keeps struggling with his memory. He constantly pushes his mind to recall his girlfriend. He sees various visions of how they lived together on Earth. After finishing their tasks, the team goes back into the hibernation chambers again, needing to spend several more months this way. Suddenly, it's revealed that John has woken up from hibernation earlier than scheduled. Due to being paralyzed for so long, he feels dizzy and can't even stand properly. He manages to sit down somehow, but then the entire spaceship begins to shake. These constant shaking moments were making John's condition even worse. But before he could make sense of it all, a panel above him started shaking. The screws of the panel had come loose, and one of them flew off and hit John directly on the head. John collapsed and lost consciousness on the spot. After some time, Nick and Captain Frank woke up when their alarms went off and found John lying unconscious. They quickly began treating him properly and soon figured out that John had passed out due to the falling panel. Once John regained consciousness, all 3 of them started trying to figure out what had gone wrong with the spaceship. They connected to the onboard computer to assess the damage. Nick suspected that perhaps asteroid fragments had struck the ship, which could have caused the problems. They connected the computer systems to analyze the situation, expecting the AI systems to show them exactly where the damage had occurred. But to their shock, the damage report showed 0% damage. If there was no damage, then why had so many alarm systems gone off? Clearly, the area above, where the panel had fallen from, was damaged, yet it wasn't showing up on the system. This was all becoming very strange. Captain Frank began suspecting that maybe the AI systems weren't telling them the whole truth. He suggested that there might be people at the command base on Earth who don't want them to receive certain information. So, they needed to find out the real reason behind all this as soon as possible. Nick, however, had already started to figure things out. He realized that many of the ship's systems were acting abnormally, and if things continued like this, they wouldn't survive the journey. Their resources would run out midway and they'd all die in space. Nick suspected that maybe the people at the Earth Command didn't want them to know the truth and just wanted them to continue the journey so that they could benefit somehow. Nick tried to convince John and then found a way to warn Captain Frank. Frank was already somewhat suspicious, but he was determined to complete the mission no matter what. So, he dismissed Nick's concerns and refused the suggestion to abort the mission and return to Earth. As they all began preparing to go back into hibernation, Nick pulled John aside to explain everything in detail. Nick turned to John and told him that they had to stop this mission at any cost. Otherwise, due to the serious malfunctions in the ship, it would lose power and be lost forever in space. Nick then shared his plan with John. He said that once everyone went back into hibernation, the two of them would wake up several hours earlier than Captain Frank, and then they could manually change the spaceship's course back to Earth. Nick was taking this step because Captain Frank would never agree to it. And now, to save their own lives, they had no other choice. By now, John was extremely confused and emotionally manipulated. He couldn't think clearly anymore. At that moment, he decided to go along with Nick's plan. However, John also said he would keep monitoring all systems and conduct his own checks. If he found any signs of malfunction, only then would he follow Nick's instructions. Nick agreed to that. Soon after, everyone went back into their hibernation chambers. Time kept passing, and a few hours earlier, as per the preset timer, John and Nick woke up from their hibernation chambers. Captain Frank was still asleep, which meant the two of them now had plenty of time to change the direction of the spaceship. John, now seemingly agreeing with Nick, began checking all the systems thoroughly on his own terms. He carefully inspected every single module, and after the inspection, he didn't find anything wrong. So John suddenly stopped Nick, saying that they shouldn't go any further with this plan. Nick became instantly worried, filled with fear that he might die out here in space. His family was waiting for him on Earth, and he wanted to go back to them. Nick believed that the astronomical agencies on Earth probably didn't want them to reveal any information about the malfunctions. It could create panic among other astronauts and future missions. Just then, Captain Frank suddenly enters from behind. Both Nick and John were shocked to see him, because he wasn't supposed to wake up for a few more hours. Captain Frank walked in and calmly explained that he had overheard their conversation before going into hibernation. So, he had also set an earlier wake-up timer just like them. However, Captain Frank wasn't angry. Instead, he gently tried to reason with Nick, saying, "If there's really a malfunction in the spaceship, I'll personally turn it back toward Earth. But for now, there's no malfunction." John, somewhere deep down, agreed with Captain Frank, and so he ignored Nick's warnings and decided to move forward with the mission. Nick, now more scared than ever, felt completely helpless. One mistake and his life could be over. Nick was still haunted by the fear that their spaceship might explode, or worse, they might get lost in deep space with no hope of rescue. Seeing Nick in this deteriorated state, John was deeply concerned and immediately reported it to Captain Frank. Captain Frank then called both of them for an emergency meeting in his chamber. When John and Nick arrived, Captain Frank shared a very important piece of information. He said that after running another routine check, he discovered some faults in the system. While these faults were minute, they could become serious over time. Even Captain Frank, who had previously denied any issues, was now convinced that the ship had developed serious problems. He admitted that if they continued forward, there was a real chance they might never make it back. Both John and Nick were terrified, realizing the full gravity of the situation. But despite knowing the truth, Captain Frank still insisted that they had to move forward with the mission. Suddenly, Captain Frank pulled out a gun. He threatened both of them, ordering them to return to their hibernation chambers and saying they would be woken up when the time came. John and Nick were completely against this, horrified by Frank's sudden aggression. But Captain Frank pointed the gun at them and forced John into the hibernation chamber first. After being injected with the hibernation drugs, it wasn't long before John noticed something terrifying. Captain Frank was attacking Nick. He was violently smashing Nick's head against the chamber wall. John, trapped inside his hibernation chamber, was unable to act. Before he could do anything, the drugs began to take effect, and he slipped into hibernation. What Captain Frank ultimately did to Nick remained a mystery to John. Time passed, and eventually, the moment arrived when John awoke from his chamber. The first thing on his mind was to find out what had happened to Nick. When Captain Frank approached him, he claimed that Nick had refused to enter his hibernation chamber, so Frank had to use some force. but that now Nick was peacefully asleep. It's time to go back into hibernation. But John didn't want to return to the hibernation chamber. He needed to find out where Nick was, and more importantly, whether he was even alive or if Captain Frank had killed him. John knew that Frank was capable of anything to get his way. So he cleverly locked Captain Frank inside a chamber, saying, "I'll only go into hibernation after I find out what happened to Nick." Captain Frank became furious, demanding that John open the door. He claimed that he couldn't disturb Nick because he was in a deep sleep. Frank tried to calm him, saying, "We'll get out of this safely, trust me." But the next moment, he opened the door, and with the gun in his hand, tried to force John into the hibernation chamber. John was ready. He knew Frank might try to do to him what he did to Nick. This time, John stood his ground. He fought back, managing to knock the gun out of Frank's hand. A violent struggle broke out between the two. But John, being quicker and more agile, landed a powerful punch straight to Frank's nose, breaking it. Captain Frank collapsed and fell unconscious. John, already emotionally unstable and deeply confused, couldn't make sense of what was happening anymore. For his own safety, he picked up the gun. But now, everywhere he looked, he saw Zoe, his girlfriend. Her visions continued to haunt him. Finally, John accepted the truth and walked toward the exit door. But just then, Captain Frank appeared, still not dead. He tried to stop John, warning, "Don't open that door. It's too dangerous. You'll destroy everything." But John was done listening. He marched forward and opened the door anyway, and another dark truth came to light. Outside the door was outer space. There was no underground Earth base. There was no Zoe who contacted him. There was no psychological test facility. They really were on a spaceship deep in space, and John had hallucinated everything. He had opened the door of a real spaceship, and what happened next was too tragic to show. And that's where our story ends.